A common example of a fractal in nature is a fern or a feather. You must have noticed how a fern is made up of little fern-like structures, which are made up of still smaller fern-like structures coming off a vein. And some ferns have 4 or 5 levels of these little ferns declining. Until fairly recently, these kind of curves, which were really discovered and described in the late 19th century, were pretty much ignored. They were called pathological curves. The reason being that it was felt that their mathematics was so complicated that their end states couldn't be calculated, and so they were called pathological. What this all changed with the invention of computers, because there are not problems so complicated that computers can't solve them. So suddenly the pathological curves, which before had been very hard to visualize at all, it became possible to create animated computer graphic movies of these things. And what was amazing about them was some families of these curves had looked like river deltas, nerve branchings, tree lines, coastlines, island chains. There was an astonishing tendency for some families of these curves to look like natural objects. And at first nobody knew exactly what to do with this. IBM has programs that produce endless landscapes. You just fly above snow-capped mountain ranges with alpine lakes, and then lower altitude areas with river-cut uplands, and then more mountains and more lakes and more deserts and more rivers, and it just goes on. And it's being created from a few lines of computer code in a raster scanning graphics system. And immediately natural scientists grabbed onto these things to describe aspects of nature that had been previously outside the realm of calculation, because you can perform a certain kind of here we are, a certain kind of almost magic with these things. As an example of how it works, once at Ojai Foundation, we were on a pilgrimage at Point Sol, which is a huge beach near Vandenberg Air Force Base. And it runs for miles with the long, low sand dunes coming in. And I was walking on this beach, and it was swept clean. I mean, it was virtually, there was nothing on it. And I came upon a heavy black pebble. And I noticed this heavy black pebble sitting there with a little pattern around it. It had obviously been deposited by the incoming tide. And I kept walking along this beach. And after about a while, I came upon an identical black pebble, just like the first one. And then I had a stroke of insight, or the Logos tapped me on the shoulder, and I decided I would perform an experiment. And at the second black pebble, I turned and retraced my steps, and I counted my steps until I had returned to the first black pebble. It was like 723 steps. And so then I continued walking, and 730 steps later, there was an identical third black pebble sitting on the beach. Well, if I had had some credulous person with me, I'm sure I could have won big money by this method. But what is happening is not mysterious at all. It's that the sea rolling into this huge bay represents a very large unresolved set of equations for chaos and turbulence, and it sorts itself out in such a way that there are hierarchical patterns of movement and force in the tide, such that every 725 steps, give or take 5 steps, the equation solves itself in such a way to deposit a black rock on the beach. Well, this verges on almost natural magic or something. And what it allows in the hands of modelers, cybernetic modelers, is the possibility that very, very complex natural systems, such as the drainage of river basins, the energy economy of a rainforest, or something like that, will be found to resolve itself into rather simple kinds of mathematically describable objects. Now, the thing to notice about fractals is the way they do their magic is they are nested, the same set of perturbations or the same set of value changes are nested again and again into each other on many, many levels. And so that what is implied if we say that there's a fractal description of the rainforest, and there's a fractal description of river systems, and there's a fractal description of the coastline of the continents, what that implies is that there therefore must be a fractal in which all of those fractals are somehow subsets, and that the planet itself is some kind of fractal object